Do you have a kink?
Do I? You can't ask me that. This is my show. I ask the questions here, actually. Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Elena Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Sleeping Around. Today's guest is... what's new? One that I'm really excited about. We are talking with Tina Horn. She is a writer, educatrix, and media maker. She is the author of Why Are People Into That? A cultural investigation of kink. Hi, Bugs. You excited about today's guest too? Which is a book based on her long-running indie fetish podcast of the same name. Tina's also the creator and writer of the sci-fi sex rebel comic book series Safe Sex and the cult detective thriller Deprog. She was also the host and co-writer of the phone sex podcast Operator. She's also a Lambda Literary Fellow, an AVN nominee, and the recipient of 2 feminist porn awards. You can find her on Instagram at Tina Horn's Ass and at her website, tinahorn.net. Today, we are talking all things kink and fetish. What is kink? What is a fetish? Where do they come from? Why do we have them? And how can we share them with ourselves or with a partner or partners? This is absolutely an episode for the curious, and so I hope you enjoy. Can we start with just you telling us a bit about yourself and how you got into working with kink and fetish and human sexuality?
Yeah, I got my start working in sexuality, working in the sex industry proper, in the Bay Area in the mid-2000s, the mid-aughts, working as a professional dominatrix, doing fetish and fantasy exploration in a independently run dungeon. And then it was a bit of a boom time, the mid to late aughts, for indie, feminist, queer, artsy, kinky porn, and then, sometimes just straight up regular schmegular gig and mainstream porn too. Mm-hmm. Feminist theory sometimes pays the bills, but not always. From my start in the sex industry, I started working a lot in journalism and media making and also the sex worker rights movement, speaking of paying the bills and, labor rights. And so I've really tried to use my literary and journalism work to bolster all of the hard work of the grassroots organizing movement of so many of my friends and comrades.
Have you seen or experienced a shift toward more authenticity, less of the kind of infringement of your rights or experience in the time that you've done this work?
That's a really great question. And the answer, which I don't mean to be cagey, but the answer is definitely yes and no. In some ways, the sex worker rights movement has made enormous strides, and a lot of that just has to do with qualities that sex workers have always had of adaptability, particularly adaptability to technology, and then adaptability to how oftentimes corporations and the government and sometimes the ideologues, or moral imperialists who influence policy on a state level, police and surveil the work that sex workers are trying to do to survive and thrive. So, for example, in the time that I've been in the sex industry, we've seen this enormous shift towards membership sites, this sort of Kleenex, Tampex brand that is associated with that entire venture, of course, being OnlyFans. No free ads, but I imagine you're familiar with OnlyFans. And there are many sites like it. And the thing that I can testify is genuinely revolutionary or liberating about OnlyFans, not even necessarily by design, but in the way that sex workers have used it is that it does give sex workers the opportunity to seize the means of production, right? And, my entire career, I have been fielding questions from porn consumers or people who would like to be porn consumers or people who I'm encouraging to be porn consumers because I think that erotic fantasy media is a wonderful thing. And, people genuinely would like to enjoy that media without feeling that they are contributing to undue exploitation or abuse of the people who are in front of the camera, behind the camera. The thing that is really cool about the way that sex workers use membership sites is that they're actually able to connect with their fans directly and produce the kind of content that they want to produce and, use the word authenticity. And that is a complicated word because when you're going to work and part of your work is emotional labor and part of your work is entertainment, it's a performance, and your ability to be good at that job might be something in the realm of authenticity, sincerity, being genuine while telling stories, while telling lies, right? While saying, oh, I'm so into this thing, like portraying a fetish, like foot fetish comes to mind, and just being like, oh my God, I love having my feet worshipped. Maybe you don't actually love having your feet worshipped at all, but that there's money in it, right? And so you perform that in the same way that any entertainer in any medium from music to film to theater would, play a role and perform it. And, people tend to get like warped and twisted ideas about that when it comes to explicit X-rated sexuality. And I try to encourage people to maybe think about things in a more critical way and compare sex work to other forms of labor, other forms of entertainment, and then also definitely forms of emotional labor, because so much of it is also about having the intuition to understand how to take care of people's feelings and needs oftentimes, that they don't even know how to ask for explicitly.
So maybe the word is not authenticity, but autonomy.
I really appreciate that pivot. Yes, bodily autonomy is really where the action is and where we'd like the emphasis to be more. And anyway, that's one arm of what I do. And then I also write about weird sex and how to find someone to match your freak.
Ooh, yes. Okay, that's somewhere I'd like to go. Before we go there, you mentioned the kind of emotional labor involved in, I assume, various forms of sex work.
Totally.
Can you just talk us through a bit more about being a dom?
Yeah.
Maybe people don't often think about the emotional kind of connective piece of a relationship like that or an interaction like that.
First of all, I want to say that my experience working in professional BDSM and fetish and fantasy exploration in the Bay Area, being a cis woman, being a white person, was absolutely like a highly privileged part of the sex industry. There's a reason that I lead with so much discussion of the sex worker rights movement and how liberated I felt by that perspective, and what I see as my responsibility to leverage my privilege or unpack my privilege at every opportunity to say, like, okay, if I learned so much about human sexuality and desire and even the human heart, the mysteries of the human heart and compatibility in relationships and community and culture, then taking it upon myself to try to translate that in order to try to make the world a better place. So, what was it like to be a dominatrix? For me, it was a lot of really stimulating and fascinating fun, even when it was incredibly hard work, and even when sometimes, I was like wrangling people who were very difficult to wrangle. And it took me years and years and years of being a professional dominatrix to even notice what I was naturally or, organically doing. And when I say organically, I mean partially like putting into work the way that I'd been socialized to be a people pleaser, to read between the lines, to pick up on the subtext of what someone was saying and interpret that in a way that would make them feel like, oh my God, this person is a psychic. But like, to me, the writing was like right there on the wall. And the more I did it, the more I would start to see patterns. And then, of course, I was really fortunate to work in a house with other doms. So for me, the work was so much about community and so much about skill sharing. And sometimes that was the skill of like the difference between a square knot and a granny knot, or the technique of, flogging someone with like 2 floggers at once, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But then also all those more like abstract skills of why are people interested in these things. And even if they come to you with a certain fantasy, if you have a client that's like, I want to run through this ritual this exact way that I've been jerking off to it for decades, what are the archetypes that are behind those fantasies? What are some ways that you can maybe push on their fantasy a little bit in a way that will blow their mind and from a purely like business perspective, get them to be obsessed with you so they'll keep bringing you money.
Repeat customers.
That's what it was like for me to be a professional dominatrix.
Okay, so let's rewind. What is kink? What is fetish? Are these interchangeable terms? Are these different things?
The short answer is yes. The way that they're used colloquially is pretty much interchangeable. I do explore in my book, Why Are People Into That? A Cultural Investigation of Kink, a little bit of the history of how these terms came to be in the parlance of our times. The truth is that a lot of the origin of the terms and the conceptualization of like what is freaky sex and what is quote unquote normal sex does come from the what in the 1800s was the emerging field of mental health and psychology, right? So initially the term fetish and the term paraphilia, which is like a little bit more of a clinical term, these were pathological terms. And by pathological, I mean terms that were, used in the DSM by medical institutions to describe what it means to be, like, sexually speaking, a sicko. I
was waiting for the word deviant or like some other.
But
no,
and then
sicko.
It's something that I find really interesting is that a lot of these early definitions of the binary between normal, healthy sex and unhealthy sex was actually supposedly an attempt to differentiate that binary from the binary that was described by other institutions at the time and had been for centuries, like the church, mostly the Christian church in the West, right? As the idea of like immoral sex versus moral sex. I think probably you and your listeners have some idea of what that binary looks like, because it does still persist to this day, unfortunately. And even how the law, which was, in the very like developmental stage at the time as well, defined like legal and illegal sex, right? Like sodomy, which just as a refresher, like all kinds of things from oral, people usually think of like gay butt stuff when they think of sodomy. I mean, I think about that as much as possible. Think about it and, any day that ends in Y is a good day for sodomy. But But yeah, even oral sex, obviously like extramarital sex, like non-missionary sex, certainly queer sex, the list goes on, has in the past been defined even, in American law as sodomy, aka like sex that you could be arrested and prosecuted for. And a lot of those laws are still on the books. So over the course of the 20th century, you can thank your local sodomizing queer perverts for liberating some of the ideas of like what kind of sex you can be allowed to have, even the public private binary and what constitutes the right to privacy versus the invasion of privacy by the state, by the police, etc. All kinds of things have contributed to a looser idea, or we could even say a more open-minded idea of what kinds of sex adults are allowed to have in peace. And kinky sex has definitely been a part of that. And queers absolutely have been at the forefront, especially with leather culture, which emerged in the West in the mid-20th century. There's a lot in my book and many other books about that history. That brings us to, the end of the 20th century and the emergence of the internet. Ever heard of it? Where, there's all kinds of jokes about like, oh, if you can think of it, there's a weird forum about it somewhere online. And I think most people are familiar with the idea of people who carried a lot of shame about their desires or their identity being able to find like-minded perverts online. And so then even this term that is pretty commonly known at this point, I would imagine, among your listeners, of BDSM, bondage, sadomasochism, domination and submission, etc., which tends to also encompass fetish sex and a lot of, quote-unquote non-normal sex that is based on fantasies and role plays and etc., etc. That term actually emerged in the early 90s on an online forum called Usenet. So much of what we now conceptualize as kinky sex is culturally produced. And even, there are terms like I have a whole chapter on cash fetishism and financial domination in Why Are People Into That? Even though being turned on by sex that involves some kind of financial transaction or exchange of sex for something of value is as old as human desire and trade. This very particular kind of fin-doming is something that I think could only exist not only with, digital payment processors, and the way that just like you get a dopamine rush from like pushing a button to send money to someone who deserves it because they're hot, but then also the way that the blogosphere and social media then like writes about and interviews people who are experts in emerging structures of desire, and then you have these terms like findom.
Before we get to the rest of the episode, I want to take a second to thank the sponsor of this week's content, CHEEX. If you are a consumer of sleeping around and you have not heard of CHEEX, my friend, you are in for a treat. CHEEX is the ultimate destination for sexual empowerment, offering a 3-in-1 platform. Ethically produced, diverse, and authentic erotic films, erotic audio, as well as the Pleasure Academy, which is their sex ed portion of the platform, where they have expert-led educational content where they cover different techniques, like techniques to use with other people or also just with yourself. They cover mental health. They cover all sorts of different aspects of pleasure. Before I get into my own experience with this platform, I do want to tell you that I have a code for all of you. If you use the code SLEEPINGAROUND, you get 7 days of free access to CHEEX. The code applies when you select the yearly plan, but you can cancel at any time during those 7 days for no charge. You could also switch to a monthly plan, so there is no risk in trying it out. What CHEEX gets right for me, well, it's a lot of things, but primarily it's the representation. This is an inclusive space. There is content curated for women. There's content curated for the queer community. This episode is all about kink. There's a variety of kink content as well as kink workshops in the Pleasure Academy. And so for somebody whose sexuality falls outside of the heteronormative standard, seeing your own experience reflected in the content that you're consuming, it makes a difference in a multitude of ways, right? Like it makes a difference in terms of self-exploration and trying out different new things to see what it is that you are into, but also self-acceptance. It's really hard to feel like your desire and your experience is valid and acceptable and nothing to be ashamed of when you don't see it reflected anywhere. CHEEX has content for diverse audiences. Plus, they ensure fair compensation and ethical production practices so you can relax and enjoy. And again, you can check it out risk-free, 7 days of free access with the code SLEEPINGAROUND. Go in, have a look, have a listen, have a learn, and thank me later. I think the common direction that we go when we think of like a kink or a fetish, it's a thing, right? As in, I have a kink and my kink is, like you said, feet. As in, it is one singular thing that is like a trait of a person. The way that I'm hearing you describe it sounds more expansive. It sounds more like almost the anti-binary missionary sex.
Yeah.
What is it? Like, how do you know? How do you define or say, I am kinky, I have kinky sex, or I am into fetish? Like, what's the delineation? I don't even know if that's important, but it's just as I'm...
Do you have a kink?
Do I? You can't ask me that. This is my show. I ask the questions here, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in that case, my answer to that question is that when is talking about your desire and your inner fantasy life, or even your sexual identity as kinky, when is it useful? And I think the answer to that question is it's useful if it can help you to get what you want. And maybe what you want is to have adventures, to have certain experiences. Maybe what you want is to find people that you are compatible with, to play with, to fuck, to make commitments to organize community around. And then when you find that, maybe you want to give back to those communities by being a leader or being an organizer, by being an educator, because you know how isolating it can feel to have a desire and not see it reflected in what little we have of sex education or representations of sexuality in schools and popular culture in the world around us. You know, we don't even encourage people to talk to their platonic friends about sex, which is something that I'm, always on my high horse about. Like, talking about sex with the people that you're having sex with is vital, and so is talking about sex with people that you are not having sex with, that you're not even trying to have sex with. And yeah, I mean, something else that I'll say about that is that, I've been talking about this sick, healthy binary that we're still inheriting from institutions, or this moral, immoral binary that we're inheriting from other kinds of institutions, even like legal, illegal, basically like good, bad, wrong, right kinds of sex. And there are a lot of people who are like interested in reclaiming and defining themselves by that messaging that we've had since we were really young, right? I mean, even, most of the terms that we use for queer identities, including the word queer, began as epithets, began as slurs, began as language that was weaponized against us, right? And so the extremely powerful act of reclaiming the word dyke is a word that I like a lot more than lesbian, even though its history is more of being a slur, but it feels more right for who I am. And like pervert absolutely feels like right for who I am. And you brought up the word deviant a few minutes ago. I love just like defining myself as a deviant, and then finding other people who like to define themselves in those ways. So it's about satisfaction and connection, just like any other kind of sex. One of the big projects of Why Are People Into That, the podcast and the book, for me, is to encourage people to think of kinks the way that they think of taste in other realms, right? So whether you have a taste for a certain genre of film or television, or fiction or nonfiction books, or conversation podcasts like this one versus highly produced NPR podcasts, or spicier, mild food, iced coffee or hot coffee. You catch my drift. Which sports team you dedicate yourself to. These tastes in sexuality are really no different from that, or insofar as they are different, I think it's useful. I find that it's useful to think of sexual tastes more expansively, because most of what we have inherited about sexual preference is very rigid. And I think that that messaging leads to more of the suffering and abuse and shame than anything that is essential to the desires themselves.
Well, and it sounds like shame is kind of underlying, or the wanting to dispel shame, the wanting to free folks from shame. It sounds like that's kind of the underlying piece of a lot of what you just shared in terms of like kink as a label, whether it's helpful to you or not. There's like this piece of reclamation, right? Of saying these words, whether they're useful in helping you find a partner or somebody to play with, or in kind of having other people understand your experience through this label, or whether it's just standing up and saying, no, this is actually something that I'm proud of and excited about and finding community in. And then thinking about sexual tastes, kinks, fetishes, in a similar way to taste in clothes, or what kind
fashion,
of
style,
cat you want.
Right, because and actually fashion is a great one to compare it to, because it's really an example of the fact that like you could have 100 high femmes in a room, which by the way, 2 tickets please. You could have 1,000 high femmes in a room, and each of them could be styled totally distinct from each other, right? So and that's true of the fetishes that I explore in Why Are People Into That, whether it is spanking or consensual non-consent, which I'm teaching an intensive on right now, or cannibalism, which was amazingly fantasy that was one of the all-time most popular episodes of my show, so I had to dedicate a chapter to that in the book, or group sex, all of the different things that I cover in the book. I mean, I think that part of the reason that sexuality continues to be something that I want to dedicate my life on and off the clock to is that it's as endlessly fascinating as each individual human being. Do you find that? Why are you doing a show about sex?
Wow, what a question. I think I feel the same. I think that having had a personal kind of journey in discovering my own sexuality and identity, and the fact that it did take me longer than I think is your average. I think coming from a community where sex was not a topic of conversation outside of a religious context, you know, you're burning in hell, all of that fun stuff to feed to children. And then my own fascination. It's like a combination of personal interest, personal experience, and a desire to share this information with more people, and to hopefully through these conversations lift some of that shame, right? Because whether we're talking about being, and I'm not minimizing this experience, it's my experience, but like all the way from being a woman who is attracted to women, right? Like, I struggled with that. From that to, you know, your most quote unquote extreme kinks or fetishes. If we're not exposed to conversations about it, if we're not seeing it represented in the media, there is this element of shame. And that's painful. Yes. So I'm hoping that through a show like this, there can be somebody out there listening who's going, oh, wait a minute, I never thought about how this thing that I'm interested in, like spanking or any of the other things we've talked about so far, that can be just like my taste in clothing, or it can be a flavor of ice cream that I like.
Exactly.
And there can be nuance within that. I have a personal excitement around the conversations because they are so vast. Like this is a topic, we could talk about this for hours, for days, for months, and that makes it kind of thrilling. I'm hoping that people learn something, you know, or feel more connected or less alone, and, you know, all of those nice
are my
things
dreams too. Yeah, and the you know, those tastes that you just brought up, we're very comfortable with the idea that those tastes might change over time, right? That we might be in like a dress wearing season for a season or a decade, and then, and I'm not like really into wearing dresses right now, or like, you just used to always get mint chip, and now I'm in like a salted caramel phase, and that's so different from how we talk about sexual preferences and tastes. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the pathology and concept of immorality, and even the concept of illegality and sodomy, that this idea that your taste is not only rigid, but also like there's this sense of like predetermination or like destiny, or like, oh no, this like thing happened. As much as I love to help people in my coaching practice unpack and explore, okay, maybe like this is your story of your root of why you're like this when you were young, and now you just like cannot get this one kind of association with being turned on out of your head. Like, that's fine. It's fine, but also I have a very post-structuralist approach to our inner lives, which is to say we have the power and autonomy to tell whatever story we want to tell, or retell our stories, whether they have to do with sex or love or anything else, throughout our lives.
Why are people into that?
Yes.
Where?
Yeah, spoiler alert, the answer in the book is like, by the end of the book, I was like, I don't know. Doesn't like.
Oh no!
Doesn't matter. Who cares? Just do what feels good. I don't know.
It's kind of a funny segue into the question, because what you were essentially just saying is this can come from anywhere, and we almost in a way create a narrative of where something comes from. I think you said association. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that, with the aim of maybe continuing to lift some shame of, let's say there's someone listening and they have some sexual kink or something that turns them on that they think, this makes me a bit uncomfy. Maybe I'm nervous. Maybe I've never talked to my partner about it, but now I'm thinking maybe I could. Or where could something like that come from is part A. And then where I'd like to go is, how can somebody talk about this with a current partner or a potential partner?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll use an example that I use in the book and wire people into that. In the very first chapter, which is on feet, which I use as a sort of entryway for talking about fetishism and how we talk about fetishism, which was kind of one of the first kernels when I was developing this book, was that I had this idea to use an exploration or investigation of how we talk about Quentin Tarantino's supposed foot fetish in the culture, to look at how we talk about fetishism in general and how we talk about like men's desire versus women's desire and like women as sexual objects and all kinds of stuff. And I talk about Quentin Tarantino quite a lot in that first chapter. And then I also talk about a queer filmmaker named Yin Q, who made this short that you can watch on the internet now called Mercy Mistress. It's semi-autobiographical film about Yin Q's time working as a pro-dom in New York City. Yin was actually one of the first people I rented a dungeon from when I moved to New York. So Yin made this short film called Mercy Mistress, and in it there is a character who is a cis man who is a client of the pro-dom character that's based on Yin. And he has a foot fetish. And he doesn't know how to talk to any of his dates about the fact that he really just wants their feet in his mouth, in addition to all different kinds of things that he's interested in sexually, but like he really, really wants beautiful feet in his mouth. Mm-hmm. There's a flashback to him being quite young and watching, I think, like a scary film or a film that had like scary and sexy parts. And like the relationship between like sexual arousal and fear is something that I'm very fascinated in. I talk about in my work a lot. Mm-hmm. But there is this scene of him sort of like hiding his face in his babysitter's feet, right? And they're like, I think freshly pedicured, like very feminine feet. So for this character, this young man who's really hot, the actor playing him is really hot, right? So he's the classic kind of client that I used to see all the time, and I still see sometimes, who is the sort of basic question is, why are you coming to see a sex worker? Like, you shouldn't have any trouble getting a date. But the galaxy brain moment is that there are all kinds of reasons that all kinds of people want to see sex workers. And, you know, the old joke is that you don't pay for a sex worker's time, you pay them to leave, right? The idea is that, you know, you pay for things to be like structured and circumscribed and contained. Another way of saying it is that you pay to not have to care about their feelings beyond, you know, the way that one would hope. I would encourage clients of sex workers of all kinds, whether you are patronizing someone's OnlyFans or going to see a professional dominatrix or going to a strip club, that you would care about their feelings insofar as you would treat them with professional respect, right? But you don't have to care about their feelings in the same way that you care about the feelings of someone that you are dating. Again, one would hope, I would encourage. So in this short film, we have this character who happens to have this very strong belief that this is his root, right? This is why he's like this. And in being able to share that with a pro-dom, this particular pro-dom encourages him, sort of puts him through this ritual to encourage him to talk to his dates more about his desires. And I don't want to spoil it, but you'll just have to check out Mercy Mistress to see how that goes for him. But I think that all of this illustrates the idea that doing some thinking about the why you're into that, doing some reading about why other people are into what you're into, and thinking of that expansively. Maybe no one is into things in exactly the particular special way that you are, but maybe you could relate to some other people who are into feet. Maybe it would even be illustrative or useful to you to see other ways that people explore the thing that you're into, and to maybe try that. I think that it can be helpful when bringing up your desire with a partner to have those roots, those stories, those explanations at the ready. And what I really want to encourage people to do is to hold that with an open hand, and to continue to be flexible and self-critical and mindful, and to hope that those desires might continue to change, and that the explanation of that desire is not like the whole picture of the complexity of who you are. Again, to compare it to a taste for ice cream, maybe somebody with more medical science training and bona fides than myself might posit a theory that you had an experience at a very formative time in your life where you had mint chip and it was the best day of your life, and you had all these like happiness hormones, neurotransmitters firing, and it was a day, I don't know, I just watched, far be it from me to bring up a Pixar movie on a sex podcast, but I was just watching Inside Out 2, and these lovely way that those films like illustrate these like abstractions about a human's inner life, that your sense of self is formed by these core memories and so on. Be ready to just talk about it in an adaptable and flexible way. I advise that as the path to happiness and getting what you want. Like, that's the long and short of it.
Could you give an example of what that could look like? How do you approach something like this in an adaptable, flexible way?
Bringing up a desire to incorporate foot worship into your sex life, for example. I mean, I have all kinds of pieces of advice for how to bring up any fetish with your partner. A lot of them have to do with putting an emphasis on the partner, putting an emphasis on, I want to do this with you because you turn me on and you are special. This is the way that I like to explore this in my fantasy. This is what I think about when I'm masturbating. I think that like sharing what you think about when you're masturbating is so hot. A lot of people feel very protective of that. And, if people want to keep that private, I respect that as well. But sharing that, emphasizing the like intimacy, the vulnerability, the connection part of it, and saying, this is how this goes in my fantasy life. But also I'm emphasizing like, I'm very open to exploring this in a way that also turns you on.
Quick disclaimer for the listener at home. She's just swapping out her headphones. So if you hear a change in audio quality or tone, that is why. You were talking about some advice in terms of talking to a partner or a potential partner about what you're into.
Make sure that you are emphasizing your interest in your partner's desire as well as advocating for your own, right? So this might be a gendered thing. This might be related to all kinds of ways that you may have been socialized to people please and put other people's pleasure before your own, or the inverse, the opposite of that. People are much more inclined to be adventurous when they know that you care about what they think and feel.
I love the piece about the emphasis on this is something that I'm into, but I'm bringing it to you because I'm into doing it with you. Like the idea that feels very different. If I'm imagining receiving this, it feels very different than this is a thing I'm into and I want to do it.
Yeah.
Versus this is a thing I'm into and I want to do it with you. And when I think about it with you, it feels exciting and thrilling and all of these things.
I also think that it is just more effective. Like, sometimes being a good person helps you to get the things that you want.
What are some common kinks and fetishes?
Just going back to my disclaimer that, like, what could be better than being a freak, deviant, pervert? You don't need to demonstrate to your partner. Lots of people like this. The point is that it turns you on. And if your partner cares about you and wants to turn you on, then that at least being on the table, maybe you can find some sort of compromise if, like, the exact way that they like it. Something that I do see a lot, that I saw a lot in my clients when I was a full-time professional dominatrix, and to this day, when I still do that work as a part of my coaching practice, I see people get kind of like stuck in their scripts a lot. And so that's part of what I try to encourage people and, like, remind people of, that, like, when you are bringing it to a partner, emphasizing the collaborative aspect of it, which could also, like, maybe you never, like, in your imagination, you never thought of the gym sock idea. But now that you know that your partner is into that, maybe that could be a new taste, literally, for you. So yes, some other kinks and fetishes that I see all the time. I see people who love pain, which we talk about as sadomasochism, right? A sadist is turned on by giving or inflicting consensual erotic pain, and a masochist is turned on by receiving, accepting consensual erotic pain. That manifests in so many different ways. It manifests in spanking. It manifests in, like, needle play and blood play. It manifests in predicament bondage, where you're put in these, like, really, like, strenuous positions and you have to hold them. So, all kinds of different torture is commonplace. And if you can tell from my voice, it's also commonplace in my house because I love pain. And, I mentioned bondage. Bondage is a very common fantasy for people because I think that it is a really wonderful way to explore power dynamics and taking control, surrendering control. People love other kinds of explorations of power dynamics, whether that is, submitting to someone by crawling around on your hands and knees, or being in service to them, like running their errands or giving them a massage, or, just doing things that they like to improve their life, or sexual service, right? Like the submissive pleasing the dominant in the way that the dominant wants to be pleased, and just being like, I don't need you to do anything to me. I just want to, like, serve and worship you. Worship is the word that we use in the kink world to describe, like, putting your mouth on someone, right? So there's foot worship, there's leg worship, there's ass worship, there's, like, ass worship, and then there's asshole worship, right? There's genital worship, whatever your genitals are. There's tit worship, whatever kind of tits you, or nipple worship, whatever kind of nipples you've got. There's armpit worship, and then, financial domination. For a lot of people, group sex is a really big turn on, and that can look so many different ways. That can be like bringing a guest star into an established couple's bedroom and having a threesome. It can be going to
a guest star. Love that language.
Yeah, or it could be, or being the guest star in somebody else's world, or, going to a sex party or throwing a sex party. That often involves an element of exhibitionism and voyeurism, exhibitionism being turned on by being watched, and voyeurism being turned on by watching.
The list goes on and on.
But a lot of what I talk about in my work is how many different kinks can be broken down into archetypes or broken down into fundamentals and like aren't
Yes.
really that different from each other. And even sex acts that we tend to talk about as quote unquote vanilla can have an element of power exchange or fetishism in the sense of like putting like a ton of focus on. I really love it when you wear a certain kind of clothing, either as part of seduction or as a part of sex, or I really like to watch you touch yourself, or I, really love to be watched while I do a dance for you, like.
It's so interesting as you're saying these things. That's like, well, we know the answer. We've talked about it at the beginning, the kind of delineation between moral and immoral, good and bad, church and state and all that. Why is it, quote unquote, normal? Why is it healthy and encouraged for somebody to love a certain type of lingerie, right? Like lace or like getting dressed up in little underwear. That is you could say that's kinky. That's a fetish. Yeah. There could be worship involved in that play. And yet that would be something I don't think many people would blink at talking with their friends about.
Totally.
But then these other things that you list are somehow, I don't know, they're somehow deviant.
The word that we haven't used yet in this conversation is taboo, right? And that's the big factor. And it's very related to a lot of the things that we've talked about, but that's the big factor in generally how comfortable people feel talking to a new partner, an established partner, friends, etc.
Yeah.
About something that turns them on is what is the relationship between that thing and some sort of social taboo. For some people, the taboo and the sense of the forbidden is a huge factor in why that desire is so charged, because you have the desire and then you have this internal reaction. I'm not supposed to want that. I'm not the kind of person who would want that. And then
the morality piece again in a way.
Yeah, and then that can just contribute to an obsession, and an obsession in and of itself is not a bad thing, but when the obsession, it becomes like rigid and inflexible at the expense of actually getting what you want, or taking care of yourself, taking care of your partner or partners, saying, I want to do foot stuff and I can only do foot stuff if you're wearing like $10,000 designer stilettos and you have this particular shade of red on your pedicure that I can see through the peep toe of this high heel, and like I have to be on my hands and knees naked and you have to be forcing me to worship my feet. Like, it's okay to know that that's what you like, just like it's okay to know my team is the Yankees or whatever. If you're like, that's what I like and I'm going to go through those paces every day for the rest of my life, that's fine. You do have to accept that part of the consequence of that rigidity is that other people might not be on board with that, and you might not get to have certain other experiences that you want to have because you are so set in your ways. And like, if you're okay with that and you find somebody who is down to be set in your ways with you, and you're actually taking care of what they like as well, then that's totally fine. And you guys should be together. And then like adventurous people can be out in these streets having adventures together. I find that flexibility and adaptability is a faster track to getting what you want.
I think that is a good place for us to wrap this up. Is there anything that I missed? Where can people find you before we go over to the Patreon exclusive content where I got a bunch of audience questions and
great.
Most of them are about kink parties. So that's what the Patreon fam is in for.
I've been to a few of those.
But tell us where we can find you. It'll all be linked in the show notes, of course.
Awesome.
But
my website is tinahorn.net. That's TINAHORN. I am on a few social medias. I am definitely most active these days on Instagram, and most places I am at Tina Horn's ass. So you can follow my ass at TINAHORNSASS. And some of the things that you will find when you check out my stuff online is Why Are People Into That? A Cultural Investigation of Kink, which is out now in hardcover, ebook, and audio form, read by me, from Hachette Books, anywhere books are sold or taken out from the library. I do write fiction comics. So if you are a comic fan or a fan of horror or sci-fi, or you think you might be into horror or sci-fi comics if they were gayer and freakier, then this is my newest comic in collaboration with Lisa Sturl and a wonderful art team that's called Deprog. It's about a Leatherdyke detective who investigates cults. So that is also out now in bookstores and comic book stores. And yeah, I have a one-on-one coaching practice that is really popping off right now, both in terms of talking to people about their desires and identities and inner lives and relationship coaching. And then also I specialize in consulting with people on writing projects and theater and television and film, especially anything that has to do with all of the things that by now you know that I am an expert in: queer identity, sex work politics, pornography, freak shit, and so on. If you're interested in working with me, check me out on tinahorn.net. And thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure to talk to you. I'm a big fan of the show.
Oh, thank you. And another thank you to CHEEX for partnering with me on this episode. Remember, you can use the code SLEEPINGAROUND to get access to CHEEX for free for 7 days. And you can cancel or change to a monthly subscription at any time, no penalty. Thanks again, CHEEX. Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlenaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at SleepingAroundPod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Elena Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Corey Mosqueda. See you next time, back here on the couch.